Ministers, generals, friends, history lovers, ladies and gentlemen. Independence, niepodległość, is a fine word with warm connotations of freedom and liberty and release from the evils of subjugation. Poland and Lithuania, therefore, are rightly celebrating the centenary of their national independence in 1918. At the same time, we need to realize that independence isn't everything. It isn't enough. It isn't the highest of the values that we treasure. Not long ago, I was talking about this to a Spanish friend, or rather a friend from Spain, who said something very significant. Spain in the 1930s, he said, was perfectly independent. We were not ruled by foreign powers, yet we were so divided that we fell into a brutal civil war whose terrible effects linger to the present day. And he added, "It is far worse to be subjugated and maltreated by your own compatriots than by unknown foreigners." There's food for thought there, I think. In my own family, 1918 does not arouse happy memories. 100 years ago, in October 1918, my father's family was mourning the loss of a son and brother, Norman Davis I, who was killed in France as an RAF pilot, and after whom I was to be named. A month later, in November 1918, my mother's family was mourning the loss of their son and brother, James Bolton, who, if you can believe it, died on the Western Front on the morning of the 11th of November 1918, on the very eve of the ceasefire. The very next day, the family was celebrating the end of the war when the doorbell rang and a messenger handed over what was then called the King's Telegram. My grandmother suffered a heart attack from which she never recovered. So, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, I'm not so sure. The word dulce is not quite right. On the wider scene, 1918 saw the independence of many European states and nations, and Poland's independence can best be understood in comparison with that of others. Polish historians, like their British counterparts, spend far too much time poring over the entrails of their own nation's past without reference to the experience of their neighbours. Yet comparison is one of the essential tools of the historian's trade. Poland has never lived on its own planet, free from events abroad. Poland gained its independence not through the efforts of Poles alone, but as one of many byproducts of the massive international conflict of 1914 to 18, which we call the Great War, which neatly destroyed all three of the partitioning powers, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Prusso-German Empire, which had ruled the Polish lands for more than a century. Without that opportunity, Poland would have remained dependent for the foreseeable future. In early 1915, only 3 years earlier, that is, the length of time which separates us from the premiership of Donald Tusk, this city, Warsaw, had belonged to the Russian Empire. The military garrison here was Russian. The Imperial University of Warsaw was Russian. And the city's largest building was the Russian Orthodox Cathedral, which then filled the space now known as Pilsudski Square. Then, in August 1915, the German army arrived. The Germans replaced the Russians and began to lay the foundations of a self-governing but still dependent Polish kingdom. The Germans never got round to appointing a king, but they reopened the Polish University of Warsaw. They permitted Poles to celebrate their national day, the 3rd of May, and they formed a military unit, the Polnische Wehrmacht, of which Joseph Pilsudski was to become the last commander. The political solution which the Germans were proposing in the autonomous Kingdom of Poland was similar to that set up by the Tsarist government in 1815 and to that created by the Soviets in 1945. It all fell apart, however, not from local resistance, but through the German army's misfortunes on the Western Front, from the abdication of the Kaiser and the expulsion of the Habsburg Emperor, and by the consequent disintegration of the Central Powers. The Polish picture, however, is but one fragment of the overall scene. In Western Europe, for example, in the United Kingdom, the end of 1918 saw a general election which in Ireland gave a crushing victory to Sinn Féin, the Irish Independence Party, and which, after multiple tribulations, led the way to the Irish Free State. In Central Europe, the collapse of the empires of the Hohenzollerns and the Habsburgs created the vacuum that was filled by the Weimar Republic in Germany, the German-Austrian Republic in Vienna, the Czechoslovak Republic, the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, i.e. Yugoslavia, the sovereign but much diminished state of Hungary, and the West Ukrainian Republic. Further east, despite the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the termination of fighting on the Eastern Front, the Bolsheviks' newborn RSFSR, or Soviet Russia, attracted no one. And every single non-Russian nation of the former Tsarist Empire seceded, broke away. That is, Finland, the 3 Baltic states, Belarus and Ukraine, the 3 Caucasian republics, and all the Muslim lands of Central Asia. What followed was a civil war in Russia between the Reds and Whites, and in all other parts of the former Tsarist Empire, a series of 3-sided conflicts between the Reds, the Whites, and local national forces. Eventually, after defeating the Whites, the Bolsheviks organized the forcible reconquest of all the newly independent breakaway states, failing only in Finland, the Baltic states, and of course Poland. The Polish Republic having reunited the parts divided by the partitions and having defended her independence sword in hand in 1920, was one of the few that escaped for a season. During the century since 1918, all those countries of East and Central Europe which had gained their independence conformed to a similar pattern. In the first instance, having created some form of democracy, often on the model of the French Republic, all, with the possible exception of Czechoslovakia, succumbed to some form of dictatorship. Even so, it is important to realize that the spectrum of dictatorships was wide, and that none of the military or personal authoritarian regimes can fairly be equated with the extreme mass-murdering totalitarian regimes, whether fascist or communist, which arose in the USSR and from 1933 in Germany. In Poland's case, a left-wing military coup in May 1926 installed the guided democracy of Marshal Pilsudski's Sanacja regime. In 1939 to 45, all the states of East Central Europe, except for Finland, were overrun, occupied, and destroyed by the Nazis and the Soviets in turn. In the words of Timothy Snyder, they became the bloodlands, the killing grounds. After World War II, the whole region, as far as Eastern Germany and Eastern Austria, were overrun by the Red Army and incorporated either into the USSR or into the Moscow-run Soviet bloc. Yet in spite of the centralized one-party despotism, many differences remained. Poland was justly described as the merriest barrack in the camp. Since the fall of the wall in 1989 and the implosion of the Soviet Union, all 15 of the ex-Soviet republics, all ex-Soviet bloc members, and all the ex-Yugoslav republics, 26 countries in total, including the Russian Federation, but not the DDR, became sovereign states. They can now be divided into the 11 states that joined the European Union and or NATO, and the rest which didn't. Under Vladimir Putin, who openly regards the demise of the Soviet Union as the century's greatest catastrophe, Russia has been using aggressive tactics to bolster its greatly weakened position. Of all those countries, for much of the last quarter century, Poland was the most successful, not only in economic terms, but also in terms of political stability, constitutional consensus, and geopolitical security. In any objective judgment, Poles have never had it so good. Unfortunately, and unexpectedly, as from 2016, Poland has been taken over by a ruling party which claims that the country is in ruins and surrounded by enemies, which is demolishing the rule of law and introducing its own brand of pseudo-democratic authoritarianism. This unhappy situation only goes to prove the wisdom of the old maxim: the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And it demonstrates that in itself, independence is not enough. Thank you.